Howard Cosell built his career by standing up to power, refusing to play it safe, and taking on issues most broadcasters were too afraid to touch. He defended Muhammad Ali when the world turned its back, gave voice to athletes silenced by racism, and transformed the sports booth into a platform for truth. But on one Monday night in 1983, 6 words slipped from his mouth and changed everything. "That little monkey gets loose, doesn't he?" The moment Alvin Garrett darted across the field, Cosell unknowingly spoke the line that would end his reign as the most fearless voice in sports. The backlash was instant, the outrage deafening. A man who had once been hailed as a champion for civil rights now stood accused of racism. It wasn't just a scandal, it was the beginning of his downfall. The question remains, was Howard Cosell unfairly judged, or did his own sharp tongue finally betray him? Howard Cosell's story began far from the glittering lights of television studios in the noisy immigrant neighborhoods of Brooklyn, where survival meant grit, wit, and never backing down. Born Howard William Cohen on March 25, 1918, in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, his parents were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe searching for safety and opportunity in a country where anti-Semitism was never far from the surface. His father, Isidore, worked as an accountant while his mother Nellie ran the household. When Howard was still a child, the family relocated to Brooklyn, a city teeming with working-class ambition, cultural clashes, and the relentless noise of the American dream being fought for on every corner. He was not the typical boy who grew up on those streets. Thin, bookish, and endlessly curious, Howard didn't rely on fists to win battles. He used words. He read voraciously, quoting Shakespeare, Keats, and even legal scholars on playgrounds where most kids were more concerned with stickball than sonnets. His ego, sharp tongue, and unrelenting confidence either won people over or earned him enemies. There was rarely any middle ground. At Alexander Hamilton High School, classmates either admired him or despised him, but no one could ignore him. That hunger to be recognized, to stand out, would become the engine of his career. By the time he graduated from NYU, Howard had stacked up achievements rare for a young Jewish man in an America where prejudice still shaped the opportunities available. He held an undergraduate degree in English literature and a law degree, a combination that gave him both mastery of language and a sharp, analytical edge. Yet he also made a defining choice that would shape his public identity. Howard Cohen became Howard Cosell, adapting a version of his grandfather's Polish surname. It wasn't an act of erasing his heritage, but of survival and strategy. He knew the world would dismiss or overlook a Cohen, but Cosell sounded unique, commanding, and unforgettable. He didn't want to blend in. He wanted to be remembered. His life took another dramatic turn during World War II when he joined the U.S. Army in 1942, serving as a major in the Transportation Corps. Stationed in New York, he encountered Corporal Mary Edith Abrams, Emmy, as he called her. She was a WAC sergeant, he was an officer, and by military law, their relationship was forbidden. But Howard, never one to bow to rules when he believed they were unjust, marched straight to a general and demanded official permission to date her. He got it. Their marriage in 1944 in a Brooklyn judge's chambers began a partnership that lasted 46 years until her death. It was the longest, most steady relationship of his life, anchoring him through storms that would test every part of his character. After the war, Cosell launched a successful Manhattan law practice, pulling in $25,000 to $30,000 a year, a hefty income for the late 1940s and early 1950s. He represented high-profile clients, including baseball legend Willie Mays, and had the makings of a long, lucrative legal career. But behind the polished office walls, he was restless. pacing and rehearsing imaginary speeches, narrating ball games to an audience of no one. The law, no matter how profitable, bored him. What he craved wasn't paperwork or contracts, but the spotlight, the stage, the chance to speak truth to the masses. The legal profession couldn't contain his ego, his hunger, or his need for recognition. Something inside him was pushing him elsewhere, toward the microphone that would change not only his life, but the very definition of sports broadcasting. By the early 1950s, Howard Cosell's restless energy could no longer be contained by the quiet routines of law practice. He had money, he had prestige, but not fulfillment. And he knew the spotlight was the only place where his voice could truly matter. That chance came in 1953 when he volunteered to host a small, unpaid radio program called Little League Reports. It was hardly glamorous. Kids interviewing professional baseball players, a niche segment buried in the schedule. But for Cosell, it was oxygen. He worked long days in his Manhattan office and rushed to the studio at night, giving his time for free, driven not by paycheck, but by hunger. For 3 years, he earned nothing, but what he gained was priceless: timing, rhythm, presence, and the instinct to control a room with words alone. He discovered the power of conversation when Yankees outfielder Hank Bauer casually criticized his manager on air, and the remark exploded into headlines. Cosell realized then that truth, spoken plainly in the moment, could shake entire institutions. He had stumbled onto the formula that would define his career: fearless honesty broadcast live. From this beginning, he launched Speaking of Sports, a program that ran for decades and made his name known across America. Unlike other broadcasters who recited box scores and offered predictable praise, Cosell dissected games like a lawyer, cross-examining a witness. He pressed for accountability, challenged coaches, and refused to flatter stars simply because they were stars. His precise language, sharp intellect, and unwillingness to bend polarized audiences. Many tuned in because they admired his courage. Others listened only to curse him. But either way, they listened, and that was all Cosell needed. He wasn't interested in pleasing everyone. He was interested in being heard. His voice, nasal and deliberate, carried a rhythm unlike anyone else in sports radio. Critics mocked it, parodied it, and even despised it. Yet it became instantly recognizable. He was a disruptor before the word was fashionable, and disruption was his brand. What began as a side project for a restless lawyer was fast becoming a career that would redefine broadcasting. Cosell had found his arena, and he would never leave it quietly. The turning point in Howard Cosell's career came not with football or baseball, but with a young boxer from Louisville named Cassius Clay. In 1964, after defeating Sonny Liston, Clay stunned the world by announcing that his new name was Muhammad Ali, and the backlash was immediate. White America refused to accept it. Newspapers refused to print it, and broadcasters clung to Cassius Clay as if acknowledging the change meant surrendering to a cultural shift they despised. But Cosell did not hesitate. On national television, he addressed him as Muhammad Ali, firmly, unapologetically, and without compromise. That decision triggered an avalanche of hate mail, accusations of betrayal, and threats that might have broken a weaker man. But Cosell was no stranger to being an outsider. As a Jewish kid in Brooklyn, he had been mocked for his name, his nose, his voice, and his ambition. He understood what it meant to be marginalized, and in Ali, he saw more than a boxer. He saw a man fighting for dignity. Their chemistry on air was electric. Ali teased him mercilessly about his toupee, his vocabulary, and his nasal delivery. while Cosell fired back with deadpan wit and mock indignation. It was playful theater, but beneath the humor was a profound respect. They trusted each other, they needed each other, and their bond transformed sports coverage into something larger than entertainment. Then came 1967, when the Vietnam War escalated and Ali refused induction into the draft. His words, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong," made him a pariah. Stripped of his title, banned from boxing, vilified in the press, Ali stood alone, except for Cosell. While others turned their backs, Cosell gave him airtime, invited him on Speaking of Sports, and defended him on national television. He called the government's actions inhuman and illegal, words that few dared to say on air. Advertisers threatened, networks warned, but Cosell didn't waver. He believed in the First Amendment and in Ali's right to his convictions. Their exchanges became legendary, not rehearsed, but raw, emotional, sometimes hilarious, always honest. At times, Ali would joke about knocking him out, to which Cosell would reply with biting sarcasm. But underneath the barbs was something rare in their industries: loyalty. For nearly 2 decades, they stood side by side, forcing millions of Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about race, war, religion, and identity, not with fists or protests, but with conversation. Their partnership was more than sport. It was a cultural earthquake. By the late 1960s, Howard Cosell was no longer just a sports broadcaster. He had become a cultural voice in a nation tearing itself apart over race, war, and identity. When sprinters Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their fists in a Black Power salute at the 1968 Olympics, most of the media condemned them as unpatriotic. But Cosell did the opposite. He gave them airtime, let them explain themselves, and reminded viewers that protest was part of democracy, not its enemy. It was a radical act at a time when networks wanted safe voices and sanitized coverage, and Cosell knew it could cost him his job. But he never blinked. He understood that sports were not separate from society. They were a mirror, and to pretend otherwise was dishonest. He had already stood by Ali when the world vilified him, and now he was extending the same platform to others who were silenced. This earned him a fierce following in the Black community, who saw him not as a pandering outsider, but as someone willing to risk his career for the truth. Yet it also made him one of the most hated men in sports media. Columnists called him arrogant, television critics mocked him, and hate mail poured in by the thousands. Even some athletes resented his tough questioning, accusing him of turning himself into the star rather than the game. But Cosell never softened. He coined the term jockocracy to describe the network's habit of hiring former athletes with no training or depth simply because of their fame. And while this made him enemies in locker rooms and press boxes, it cemented his reputation as the man who would not compromise. By the end of the decade, Cosell had become more than a commentator. He was a lightning rod for national debate. His booth was not just a seat at a game, it was a courtroom, a pulpit, a stage where America's deepest wounds were exposed. He believed that if athletes were asked to perform for millions, then their humanity deserved to be seen and heard too. In a time of assassinations, protests, and war, Howard Cosell was proving that the sports world was not immune from the battles raging outside the stadium. And with every broadcast, he forced viewers to face truths they would rather ignore. By 1970, Howard Cosell had already carved out a reputation as the sharpest tongue in sports media. But when ABC launched Monday Night Football, his career entered a new stratosphere. The network wanted more than play-by-play. They wanted drama, personality, and theater. And producer Roone Arledge handpicked Cosell to deliver it. The trio of Frank Gifford, Don Meredith, and Cosell was unlike anything television had ever seen. Gifford brought polish and credibility as a former player. Meredith provided comic relief, and Cosell was the lightning rod, the outsider who challenged not just the game, but the culture around it. The NFL initially objected, worried Cosell's abrasive style would alienate fans, but the gamble paid off. Ratings skyrocketed, surging nearly 50% in the first year alone. And suddenly, Monday night was no longer just another slot on the schedule. It was an event. Fans didn't just tune in for touchdowns, they tuned in for the arguments, the banter, and the signature cadence of Cosell turning a football play into high drama. Advertisers lined up, ABC charged record fees, and the show transformed live sports into primetime entertainment. Cosell's voice became unavoidable. His call during the 1973 Joe Frazier versus George Foreman fight, "Down goes Frazier, down goes Frazier," became one of the most iconic moments in sports broadcasting, proof that he could turn an instant into history with the weight of his words. But success came with turbulence. Behind the scenes, Cosell clashed with producers who wanted him to tone down, sparred with fellow broadcasters, and feuded with sports writers like Dick Young, who accused him of being arrogant and self-serving. He coined the term jockocracy to ridicule networks for hiring ex-athletes who lacked broadcasting skill. A jab that made him even more enemies inside the very industry he was reshaping. His drinking also became a problem, culminating in an infamous 1970 broadcast where he slurred his words and vomited on air after too many martinis. Yet ABC kept him because viewers could not turn away. By the mid-1970s, Monday Night Football was a phenomenon, drawing audiences that rivaled primetime dramas, and Howard Cosell was both its greatest asset and its greatest controversy. To some, he was a pioneer, to others a pompous distraction. But love him or hate him, America was watching him. And for Cosell, that was victory. September 5, 1983 was supposed to be just another night of football. The Washington Redskins facing the Dallas Cowboys in the season opener, millions of viewers tuning in to the familiar banter of Monday Night Football. For 13 years, Howard Cosell had been the voice that cut through the noise, the man fans either loved or loathed, but always listened to. That night, as Washington wide receiver Alvin Garrett slipped a tackle and sprinted up the field, Cosell uttered 6 words that would change his career forever. "That little monkey gets loose, doesn't he?" The words flashed coast to coast in an instant, and the storm began before the game even ended. Phone lines at ABC exploded with complaints, newspapers prepared furious headlines, and civil rights leaders mobilized. To many viewers, the remark was more than a casual description. It was racist, degrading, and inexcusable from a man who had once been hailed as a defender of black athletes. Reverend Joseph Lowery of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference demanded a public apology, pointing not just to Cosell's words, but to the deeper problem of black athletes dominating the field, while black voices were absent in the booth. The outrage struck a cultural nerve. America in 1983 was no longer the America of 1964. Conversations about race were sharper, sensitivities higher, and context mattered less than perception. Cosell tried to explain himself, first denying he said it, then admitting the phrase, but insisting it had no racist intent. He pointed to tapes where he had used the same phrase for white players like Mike Adamle and Glenn Hubbard, even affectionately for his own grandchildren. ABC defended him, reminding the public that this was the same man who had stood by Ali, supported Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and given a voice to athletes no one else would touch. But none of it slowed the backlash. Radio hosts, television pundits, and columnists tore him apart. Even colleagues were divided, some siding with him, others distancing themselves. Cosell, already weary of what he called the stagnant bore of Monday Night Football, grew bitter and exhausted. By the end of the 1983 season, he walked away, not technically fired, but effectively silenced. 6 words had erased decades of defiance, loyalty, and courage. The man who had made his career by standing with the marginalized now stood accused of the very prejudice he had spent a lifetime fighting. After the storm of 1983, Howard Cosell's world shrank quickly. Though ABC gave him another chance with SportsBeat in 1984, a 30-minute news magazine that allowed him to lean into the hard-edged journalism he loved, the reprieve was brief. The show won awards, even Emmys, but Cosell's candor once again came back to haunt him. In 1985, he released his memoir, I Never Played the Game, an unflinching takedown of the television industry and a blistering critique of colleagues like Frank Gifford and Don Meredith. The book alienated friends, angered executives, and within months, ABC canceled SportsBeat. The man who had once dominated Monday nights was suddenly left with only radio, and even there his presence seemed diminished in a landscape now chasing flash, entertainment, and safer voices. His relevance was slipping, and he knew it. The most devastating blow came in 1990, when Emmy, his wife of 46 years, died. She had been his anchor through wars, battles with networks, and endless controversy. The only steady voice in a world built on confrontation. Without her, Cosell unraveled. Friends described a man smaller, frailer, broken in ways that no audience ever saw. His health began to collapse. Cancer took its toll, then heart disease, Parkinson's, and a series of strokes that left him physically weakened and mentally tired. By 1992, he retired completely, withdrawing into an isolation that seemed unimaginable for a man whose voice had once echoed across every living room in America. Reporters who caught glimpses of him in those years found a figure who looked haunted by how quickly the world had moved on. He wasn't bitter about the 6 words that had ended his career, so much as the silence that followed, the way the industry he helped shape discarded him without ceremony. The spotlight that had once fed him was gone, and in its absence, Cosell shrank into solitude, an icon reduced to shadows, his legend clouded by controversy. His final years marked not by triumph but by grief and decline. Howard Cosell died on April 23, 1995, at the age of 77 in New York City. His body weakened by years of cancer, heart disease, Parkinson's, and strokes. But in truth, his voice had been gone long before. The news of his passing drew mixed reactions that mirrored the divisions of his career. Some hailed him as a pioneer who transformed sports broadcasting from bland play-by-play into fearless storytelling, the conscience of American sports who stood by Muhammad Ali, defended the protests of Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and gave a platform to athletes the establishment wanted to erase. Others dismissed him as an arrogant relic, a man undone by his own ego and a single careless phrase uttered in 1983 that overshadowed decades of courage. The New York Times praised his brilliance, while noting the isolation he had brought upon himself with his sharp tongue. ABC offered a polite statement, restrained compared to the drama he had once brought to their network. Yet even amid divided memories, the industry could not ignore what he had done. In 1993, TV Guide named him the greatest sportscaster of all time, and the same year he was inducted into the International Jewish Sports Hall of Fame. In 1994, he entered the Television Hall of Fame, and after his death, he was honored with a posthumous Sports Emmy and inducted into both the American Sportscasters Hall of Fame and the International Boxing Hall of Fame. Still, for many fans and critics, His legacy narrowed to those 6 words spoken about Alvin Garrett on a Monday night in 1983. It did not matter that Garrett himself publicly said he took no offense, that Jesse Jackson defended Cosell's character, or that Muhammad Ali stood by him until the end. What mattered was perception, and perception never forgave. Howard Cosell's story is one of triumph and tragedy. A man who fought for truth, yet was undone by the very force that defined him, his voice. He remains a reminder that in a world where words carry power, they can also carry destruction, and that even the most fearless can be silenced by a single moment. The question that lingers is the same one posed in his lifetime. Was Howard Cosell unfairly judged, or did his relentless honesty finally catch up with him?